Morning all. Let's have a look at one of the very interesting encounters in the Tal Memorial in round 4, the 2013 Tal Memorial. Caruana playing white against Nakamura. He plays e4. Now Caruana is known to be a kind of positional player, more on the positional side, and Nakamura more on one of the greatest tacticians the game has in the world today. So after c5, maybe a little bit surprising that Caruana has chosen this very, very sharp open Sicilian variation and going into the Najdorf variation now. Now f3 is a kind of English attack system. A lot of English grandmasters were playing like this, casting queenside and later g4, g5. The idea is kind of reusing what you play against the Sicilian dragon, but black hasn't even fianchettoed this bishop. So it's shielding that g4 square from the knight coming to g4. Black reacts now with e5 after knight b3. Now bishop e6. Given white's plan is g4, after bishop e3 you might find this next move quite surprising, but it has been played before. It's kind of prophylaxis type move. h5, trying to clamp down on g4. Black really wants to try to prove that white has weakened these dark squares with this light square pawn structure, slight weaknesses on the dark squares. If you can get rid of this bishop later or celebrate these dark squares here, that would be great. Queen d2, knight bd7. And now knight d5. White is not interested in maintaining a lock on d5. He's actually occupying d5 and creating a structural transition here. In terms of pawn structure now, after knight takes d5, e takes d5, bishop f5, let's examine the double-edged sword of what's happened. Although white cannot put a piece now on d5, he has created a kind of majority of pawns here where c5 would look to be quite effective in the future. Also, the knight is bearing down potentially on the queen side, not at the moment, but potentially knight a5 could be useful as well. So white's plan is now, because of the pawn structure like this, with this advanced pawn on d5, it's leaning towards queen side pressure and advancing on the queen side generally. Also, note that this pawn is really locking down this bishop. Unless this bishop can be made use of, it could be a very, very bad piece later. Bishop e2, and we see rook c8, not moving this bishop at all. No hurry to do anything with these two pieces at the moment. Rook c1, and now actually we have the very interesting queen h4 check. What is going on here? What is this queen h4? Well, white actually played g3. You could argue weakening some squares a little bit. If bishop f2, I think this might be playable. Bishop f2, queen a4, bit materially driven is an engine suggestion, but I don't think this is a big deal. c4, I mean, this is presumably too dangerous to snatch this pawn. This is big trouble now. So that's not the idea. I think after bishop f2, maybe just dropping the queen back, and that's okay. But this is okay as well. g3, it's no big problem. The queen drops back to f6. White castles. Bishop e7. Now this move knight a5, so pressure starting to bear down on black's queen side. Rook c7. b6 is covered at the moment, otherwise this would be quite annoying. Knight is covering b6. Bishop d3. Like castles. And now c4. This queenside plan is looking quite dangerous. Spearheaded by this advanced pawn here. This break with c5 potentially could leave white with dangerous passed pawns. Naka takes on d3, queen takes d3, and now rook e8, and now b4. So this c5 is looking really dangerous. But what is the downside? We must look for the double-edged sword in chess of everything, even something which looks very, very promising here for white. Well, on c5, technically this knight could be a bit looser. There's some potentially issues with d5 being a bit looser. At the moment, it seems c5 still isn't a problem for black. He's geared up against c5. He plays bishop f8, rook c e1, and now let's move g6, which gives the bishop an opportunity to use these squares when this bishop's not eyeing h6 as well. h6 could be an option, but this diagonal could be a nice place for the bishop. Queen d2. Okay. Is there an immediate threat? Not particularly. There's no skewing or anything with bishop g5, but queen f5 was played here. a4. It seems very logical to carry on the queen side. And, you know, black cannot seemingly do anything in reaction. You might think, well, what is black's pawn play? Is it like h4? h4 would seem too weakening. Perhaps it can even be answered by g4 here. g4. This doesn't really help black. So white seems to have the structural plan to stretch out on the queen side, and black doesn't seem to have any corresponding counterplay with pawn structure, at least. But Naka plays knight f6, and then we see bishop b6. This might be slightly on the dubious side. Engine suggests c5 here. That looks extremely logical. Just increasing the pressure, and maybe even c6 is on the cards now, which would be a really great pawn to have, and potential for passed pawns, dangerous passed pawns. But instead, this move, bishop b6, was played. Naka retreats. And now, an even more surprising move now at move 25. f4. I think if you showed this move f4 to quite a few club players, they would be surprised, because after e4, what has black got? He's got a dangerous protected passed pawn. Okay, white has succeeded in being able to make use of the d4 square now, and that would seem to be rather clever. On the other hand, you know, the g4 square, these, you know, access to h3, this could be dangerous as well. So let's see, bishop d4. No immediate threat to win a pawn or anything. Rook c7. Actually, pardon me. In this position, after bishop d4, knight takes b7. Is that really on the cards here? No, because of rook takes c4. Okay, so rook c7 wasn't just protecting the pawn, it was just to maybe to double on with rook e7. So after h3, bishop g7. Why not take the pawn? Queen takes h3. What's going on here? Bishop takes f6. That pawn cannot be taken. So bishop g7. Now the threat surely is queen takes h3, protecting that. So queen g2. And it looks as though white is wanting to gain potentially space with g4 soon. But here, Naka breaks out with a really energetic move, questioning the stability of white's structure here. He plays the move b5. It seems to be intuitively a very strong move to kind of blow up white's centre. This double-edged sword of the advanced pawns here is that they're potentially weak. This temporary, well, it's not even a pawn sacrifice, it's just undermining d5. Straightforward undermining white's centre. And now we see Caruana take on b5, a takes. Even worse now, bishop takes f6. Intuitively, giving up the dark square bishop is not something you'd want to do lightly here. This bishop now is a fantastic bishop, and in stark contrast to some previous Nakamura games in the Sicilian. For example, against Magnus Carlsen, this bishop was totally dead, the dark square bishop, but here it's got life in this position. And now white plays g4, which does start to weaken other squares. After hg, there's also now the possibility of this h file being used, or maybe by both players, but more likely in this position with this dark square bishop by black at some point. Very, very dangerous. Naka maybe senses that. He plays bishop d4 check after king h2, a sitting target with tempo for an eventual maneuver like this. But first the queen must move. Immediately also queen h4 is pretty dangerous. We see knight c6 attacking the bishop. Naka wants to keep that bishop. g5 weakening even more squares. Potentially queen f5. This looks like a desperate position now for white. Black really has a very serious threat of doing this. You might think, well, why can't white play queen? Well, queen h3, black could just take on c4 here. This undermining is still in progress. So white tries c5. After d takes c5, knight e5. It's not too convincing. Naka just snaps up this b4 pawn here. What about taking on e4, you might ask? Well, if white takes on e4, just king g7, it's a really killing idea, crushing idea with rook h8 check here. Look at this bishop on this diagonal. This is kind of thematic sort of stuff for the King's Indian defense, where you put your bishop on this diagonal and then the attack is often more effective. But here, you know, this is gone now, I believe, for white. d6. Okay, rook c3, cutting off even queen h3 now as a resource. And after rook takes e4, just the crushing king g7 is played with the gigantic threat of rook h8 check. An amazing game. It seems Caruana overextended optimistically, leaving his king very, very weak. What a nasty position to have in this final position. The knight's kind of pinned as well to e4. Let's give an example. So say he plays rook f3, then he loses the rook. That's no good. That's actually one of the top engine choices. That's why I mentioned that. Knight g4 loses the rook. So there's no actual real defense here actually, because this bishop is cutting off the king from h2. What on earth can white do here? What a total disaster for white. Well done, Naka. Fantastic game in round 4. Comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.